The cockpit stank of recycled sweat and ozone. It always did. 5 years of marginal life support, jury-rigged coolant lines, and the faint chemical bite of PPC capacitor bleed had soaked into every surface of the Warhammer's command couch until the smell had become indistinguishable from Elias Thorne's own skin. He hadn't noticed it in months, maybe years. The things you stop noticing when you stop living and start hunting are the quiet things first. The smell of your own machine. The way your hands shake when you're not gripping the control sticks. The fact that you haven't spoken to another human being in 11 days. He noticed the cold, though. Corvost 4 was a frozen wound of a world. A periphery mining colony that had been dying long before the toxins in the processing runoff turned the groundwater into something that etched steel. The external temperature rating on his heads-up display read -42 Celsius, and the wind was driving ice crystals sideways across the shattered industrial landscape at 60 kilometers per hour. Even through 70 tons of armor and Mylmer, Elias could feel the deep ache of it in the Warhammer's joints. The old girl protested cold weather. She always had. His father had told him that. Sitting in the same cockpit 20 years ago, a younger Elias perched on Marcus Thorne's knee while the old man walked the family's most prized asset through a live fire exercise on some forgotten world. She runs hot, son. Warhammers always do. 2 Donald particle projection cannons, each one pulling enough energy to light a small city. She wants to be warm. You keep her warm, she'll keep you alive. The memory was sharp enough to cut, and Elias pushed it away with the ease of long practice. He had gotten very good at pushing things away. The Warhammer, designation Whiskey Hotel Mike 6 Romeo, had been in the Thorne family for 3 generations. His grandmother had salvaged it from a battlefield on Safan during the 3rd Succession War, walking it out of a smoking crater with 1 leg actuator seized and half the armor stripped away. She'd rebuilt it with her own hands in a rented machine bay, and it had been the seed around which the Iron Skull's Mercenary company had grown. 60 men and women at their peak. 4 full lances. Dropship contract with a battered old overlord class called the Anvil's Promise, flying half empty to fit their 16 mechs. They'd never been famous, never been rich, but they'd been family in the way that only people who bleed together can be. Now it was just Elias and the Warhammer, the last 2 Iron Skulls in existence. He checked his weapon status out of habit. The twin Dummel PPCs mounted on the mech's forearms showed green across the board, capacitors fully charged, magnetic containment holding steady. The paired Martel medium lasers in the torso were nominal. The paired Sperry Browning machine guns, his close-in anti-personnel weapons, showed full belts of ammunition. And mounted in the side torsos, the twin small laser backups that most Warhammer pilots treated as an afterthought, complementing the Holly SRM 6-rack nestled in the right torso. Elias had learned never to dismiss any weapon in the kind of fights he'd been in over the past 5 years. Engagements that were less battles and more bar brawls between walking tanks. Every last joule of energy mattered. The heat sinks were his constant concern. 20 of them, standard models, struggling to manage the thermal output of a mech designed to fight at the razor's edge of heat tolerance. His father had added 2 extra sinks to the chassis during a refit on Galatea, pulling tonnage from the rear armor to fit them. It was a trade-off that told you everything about how Elias Thorne fought. Face the enemy. Always face the enemy. What's behind you doesn't matter. Elias had kept the modification. He'd added his own over the years. A slightly upgraded targeting computer salvaged from a destroyed Marauder. Custom vibration dampeners on the PPC mounts to tighten his groupings at range, and a calm suite upgrade that let him slice through most standard military encryption. That last one had been the most expensive and the most useful. You didn't hunt ghosts with guns. You hunted them with information. A burst of static crackled through his neurohelmet. Elias adjusted the frequency, his fingers moving with the automatic precision of a man who had spent more time in a cockpit than out of one. The signal resolved into a repeating navigational beacon. Low power, civilian grade. It was coming from the industrial complex, 12 kilometers to the northeast. A sprawling ruin of ore processors, smelting towers, and chemical storage facilities that had been abandoned when the colony's mining operations collapsed 8 years ago. The beacon was new. It hadn't been there when Elias had made his orbital scan 3 days ago. Someone had arrived on Corvost 4, and they were announcing their presence. Elias felt the old familiar tightness in his chest, the compression of every nerve in his body into a single focused point. He had felt it the first time on Dorval's Crossing, 5 years and 2 months ago, the day the Iron Skulls died. He closed his eyes and let the memory come, just for a moment, just enough to sharpen the edge. The contract had been routine, garrison duty on a periphery world that nobody cared about, protecting a small mining operation from pirate raids. The pay was modest, the risk was low, and Captain Rhea Vasquez, the Iron Skull's commanding officer, had taken it as a rest rotation after a brutal 6-month campaign in the Oregon Reach. They'd set up a defensive perimeter, established patrol routes, and settled into the comfortable monotony of garrison work. The Serpent's tooth had come in on a false contract flag. 4 mechs, a full lance, transmitting Mercenary Review Board identification codes that marked them as a friendly relief force. Elias had been on the far patrol route, 12 kilometers from the base, when the first shots were fired. He'd heard Captain Vasquez's voice on the comm, calm at first, then urgent, then screaming. By the time he'd pushed the Warhammer to its maximum running speed of 64.8 kilometers per hour, covering the distance in an agonizing 11 minutes, it was over. 16 mechs the Iron Skulls had fielded. 16 machines crewed by people he'd grown up with, trained with, bled with. The Serpent's tooth had hit them during a shift change, when half the pilots were out of their cockpits and the other half were running minimal alert status. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. PPCs and autocannon fire into parked mechs. Missile salvos into the barracks. The Anvil's promise, their dropship, burning on the landing pad with its drives torn open. Elias had arrived to find the Serpent's tooth already withdrawing. their mechs backlit by the fires of everything he had ever known. He'd fired both PPCs at maximum range, the azure lightning bolts reaching across the darkness, and he'd hit something, a hunchback, he thought, scored deep into the left torso. But they hadn't turned to fight. They'd simply faded into the night, leaving Elias alone in a graveyard. He'd spent 3 days in the wreckage, searching for survivors. He found none. Elias opened his eyes. The heads-up display glowed softly in the darkness of the cockpit, painting his gaunt face in shades of green and amber. He was thinner than he'd been 5 years ago. Harder. The clean-shaven jaw of a young mercenary had given way to a permanent growth of dark stubble shot through with premature gray. His eyes, once bright with the easy confidence of a man surrounded by comrades, had gone flat and watchful, predator's eyes. He engaged the Warhammer's drivetrain and felt the familiar shudder as the fusion reactor fed power to the leg actuators. The mech took its first step, then another, finding its rhythm on the frozen ground. 70 tons of steel and fury, walking toward a signal that might finally mean the end of everything. The trail that had led him to Corvost 4 had been long and winding, paid for in blood, sweat, and the slow hemorrhage of sea bills he couldn't afford to lose. 5 years of hunting. 5 years of dead ends, false leads, cold trails, and the occasional violent encounter with people who didn't want to be found. It had started on Galatea, the mercenary star, where Elias had gone to file his report on the destruction of the Iron Skulls. The Mercenary Review Board office there was a squat, ugly building full of squat, ugly bureaucrats. But Elias had found one sympathetic ear. Dorian Keach, senior handler, 20-year veteran of the MRB, a gray-haired man with a quiet voice and a seemingly endless supply of patience. Keach had listened to Elias's account, reviewed the sensor logs from the Warhammer's battle recorder, and promised to investigate. The investigation had gone nowhere. Officially, the Serpent's tooth didn't exist. No bonded contract on file. No registration with the MRB. Ghost identifiers, forged transponder codes. Whoever they were, they'd been professionals. Keach had been the one to suggest Elias keep working. "You stop moving, you die," the old man had said, pouring Elias a drink from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer. "I've seen it 100 times. Pilots who lose their unit, they sit down and they never get up again. You want to find these people? You need resources. Take contracts, small ones. Keep your skills sharp, keep your mech running, and keep your ears open. The Periphery is full of whispers if you know how to listen." It was good advice. Elias had taken it. He'd spent 5 years as a solo operator taking the contracts nobody else wanted. Pirate hunting in the deep Periphery. Escort duty for smugglers. Security work for mining operations on worlds so remote they didn't appear on standard star maps. The pay was terrible, the conditions were worse, and the danger was constant. But Keach had been right about the whispers. Elias had pieced the Serpent's tooth together, one fragment at a time. A name here, a mech sighting there. A drunk aerospace pilot in a cantina on Herodotus who remembered ferrying a lance of mechs with Serpent insignia off Dorval's crossing. on the night of the massacre. A black market arms dealer on Astrakazi who'd sold autocannon ammunition to a unit matching their description. A salvage broker on Antalos who'd fenced components stripped from Iron Skull mechs. Components that still bore the serial numbers Elias had memorized from his family's maintenance logs. Each fragment cost him. Sometimes sea bills, sometimes blood. Once, on a frozen moon orbiting a gas giant in an unnamed system, it had nearly cost him the Warhammer itself, when an ambush by local pirates had caught him in a crossfire between a Jenner and a commando. He'd put both light mechs down, but not before they'd shredded his rear armor and nearly breached the reactor shielding. It had taken him 4 months, and every Seabill he had to repair the damage, working with his own hands in a rented bay on a station that smelled of hydrogen fuel and desperation. Through it all, Keech had been his anchor, monthly encrypted transmissions, checking in, offering what intelligence the MRB could provide, reminding Elias that someone in the universe still cared whether he lived or died. It wasn't much, but for a man drowning in obsession, it was enough to keep his head above water. Now, finally, the fragments had coalesced into a picture. 4 mechs, 4 pilots, operating under a rotating series of false identities but always returning to the same pattern. A Marauder, a Wolverine, a Hunchback, the one Elias had scored on Dorval's Crossing, now bearing a distinctive repair weld on its left torso, and a Panther running scout and electronic warfare. The Serpent's tooth, his prey. He'd tracked them to Corvost 4 through a shipping manifest era. A single line item that listed mech-scale ammunition being delivered to a world that had no registered military presence. The ammunition type was standard autocannon rounds, compatible with the General Motors Whirlwind Autocannon 5, mounted on a Marauder MAD 3R. It was a small mistake, but after 5 years, Elias had become a connoisseur of small mistakes. The terrain changed as he moved northeast, the flat frozen plains giving way to the outskirts of the industrial zone. Shattered ferrocrete buildings rose from the ice like broken teeth, their walls stained with chemical residue in shades of yellow and sickly green. Cooling towers loomed overhead, their interiors choked with frozen condensation. Pipe networks ran between the structures like mechanical arteries, many of them burst and sagging under the weight of accumulated ice. It was a landscape designed to constrain mech movement, to funnel 70-ton machines into channels where they could be ambushed, flanked, and destroyed. Elias slowed the Warhammer to a walk, reducing his speed to barely 20 kilometers per hour as he threaded between a collapsed ore processor and a row of storage tanks. His sensors painted the environment in overlapping layers of data: infrared, magnetic anomaly detection, seismic analysis. The cold was actually helpful here. Any active fusion reactor within 5 kilometers would stand out against the frozen background like a bonfire in a dark room. He found the first heat signature at 4.2 kilometers, then a second, a third, and a fourth. 4 reactors, 4 mechs, right where he expected them to be. Elias's hands tightened on the control sticks. His breathing slowed. The Warhammer's cockpit suddenly felt very small, very close, the walls pressing in like the interior of a coffin. 5 years. 5 years of his life compressed into this single moment. Every Sea-bill spent, every lead followed, every cold night in a freezing cockpit on a world whose name he'd already forgotten. It all came down to what happened in the next hour. He opened a secure channel and transmitted a short burst, encrypted and compressed. A single word: contact. The transmission would reach Keech on Galatea in about 3 weeks, bounced through a series of civilian communication relays. By then, whatever was going to happen here would be long over. But Elias had made a habit of reporting his movements. If the Serpent's tooth killed him today, at least someone would know where to find his grave. He pushed deeper into the industrial complex. The buildings grew taller, the corridors between them narrower. The Warhammer's shoulders nearly scraped the walls in places, showering the frozen ground with fragments of corroded metal. His seismic sensors picked up vibrations, the unmistakable rhythmic tremor of mech footsteps, multiple contacts, moving in a pattern that suggested organized patrol routes. They knew he was here. The navigational beacon had been a lure. They were waiting for him. Elias smiled. It was a thin, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Let them wait. He found a position in the shadow of a massive ore crusher, a structure large enough to hide the Warhammer's full profile. He powered down to minimal emissions, letting the reactor idle at its lowest output. And he waited. He watched. He listened. The Serpent's tooth moved through the industrial ruins with practiced coordination. The Panther, a 35-ton light mech bristling with its Lords-like PPC, and a single SRM, 4-rack, ranged ahead as a scout, its movements quick and nervous. The Hunchback followed, 50 tons of Bruiser with its massive Tomodzuro autocannon 20 mounted in the characteristic right shoulder hump. Elias recognized the repair weld on the left torso, a long, jagged seam where his PCP bolt had melted through the armor 5 years ago. It was like seeing a scar he'd personally inflicted. The Wolverine moved on the Hunchback's flank, a solid 55-ton workhorse carrying its General Motors Whirlwind Autocannon 5, an SRM, 6-rack, and medium laser. Versatile, mobile, dangerous. And behind them all, moving with the deliberate, rolling gait of a heavy mech in no particular hurry, came the Marauder. 75 tons. The MAD. 3R, one of the most iconic and feared designs in the inner sphere. Twin Magna Hellstar PPCs mounted on the articulated arms, a General Motors Whirlwind Autocannon 5 in the dorsal mount, and a pair of medium lasers for close-in work. It was a mech designed for one thing: killing other mechs. And the pilot, whoever they were, moved it with the fluid confidence of a veteran. Elias felt a pulse of something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear. He'd burned through fear long ago. This was recognition. Professional respect for a worthy adversary. The Marauder's pilot knew how to use the terrain. keeping the heavier mech positioned where the buildings provided cover for its relatively thin rear armor, while the forward weapons had clear firing lanes. Textbook Lance Command. He studied their patrol pattern for 40 minutes, counting steps, timing rotations, mapping the gaps. The Panther passed closest to his position, within 200 meters, and Elias held his breath, even though there was no logical reason for it. The light mech's sensors swept across his hiding spot. He watched the Panther's head twist on its actuator, pause, and then move on. His low-power emissions had blended with the ambient thermal noise of the cooling industrial machinery. The gap he'd been waiting for opened at the 43-minute mark. The Panther moved to the eastern perimeter. The Wolverine and Hunchback converged on a junction point to the north. The Marauder was isolated, temporarily, in a wide clearing that had once been a vehicle marshalling yard, 400 meters from Elias's position. 400 meters, well within PPC range, well within the Warhammer's reach. Elias brought the reactor to full power. The Warhammer surged to life around him. Myomer bundles contracting, actuators engaging, weapon systems cycling from standby to active. The twin Donal PPCs hummed as their capacitors reached full charge. A sound Elias felt in his teeth, in his bones, in the darkest part of his soul. He stepped out from behind the ore crusher and fired. Both PPCs discharged simultaneously, twin bolts of man-made lightning that crossed 400 meters in an eye blink. The first bolt struck the Marauder's right arm, vaporizing armor and a spray of molten armor plating. The second hit center torso, cratering the forward plating and sending the 75-ton mech staggering backward. The thermal broom was enormous, a white flash that momentarily overwhelmed the heads-up display. The Marauder didn't fall. Its pilot was good, twisting the machine at the moment of impact to distribute the kinetic energy, riding the blow like a boxer rolling with a punch. The return fire came fast, both Hellstar PPCs cycling and discharging in a rippling double shot that carved through the air where Elias had been standing a half-second before. He'd already moved, driving the Warhammer into a lumbering sprint between two processing towers, the mech's feet crashing through frozen debris. The comm channel erupted with encrypted traffic. The Serpent's tooth was coordinating, the Panther and Hunchback and Wolverine converging on his position. Elias had expected this. He'd planned for it. The industrial complex was a maze, and he'd spent 3 days memorizing its layout from orbital scans. He knew every corridor, every choke point, every dead end. He ducked into a narrow passage between two chemical storage facilities, a gap barely wide enough for the Warhammer's shoulders. The Hunchback wouldn't fit. The Marauder definitely wouldn't fit. The Wolverine might, and the Panther could. But in this tight space, the Panther's light armor would be a death sentence against the Warhammer's firepower. He emerged into a secondary processing yard and found the Panther waiting for him. The light mech had been agile, utilizing its jump jets to bypass the terrain and cut through the complex on a parallel route. Its Lord's Light PPC fired at point-blank range, the bolt slamming into the Warhammer's left torso and sending a cascade of damage warnings across the display. Elias grunted, absorbing the impact, and triggered both Martel medium lasers. The twin beams of coherent light carved across the Panther's chest, melting armor in glowing furrows. The smaller mech backpedaled, its SRM, 4 launching a salvo of short-range missiles that peppered the Warhammer's legs with small explosions. Elias didn't waste his PPCs on the Panther. The light mech was a distraction, and the real threat was the Marauder, which was even now working its way around the complex to flank him. He drove the Warhammer forward, closing the distance to the Panther, and fired the machine gun. The stream of heavy-caliber slugs stitched across the light mech's cockpit armor, spiderwebbing the ferroglass viewport. The Panther's pilot flinched, an involuntary human reaction, and Elias used that half-second of hesitation to shoulder past, shoving the lighter mech aside with 70 tons of momentum. The Panther stumbled. Elias was already moving, driving deeper into the complex, following the route he'd mapped. Behind him, the calm chatter intensified. They were angry now. Good. Angry pilots made mistakes. He rounded a corner and nearly walked into the Wolverine. The 55-ton mech was waiting in an ambush position, partially concealed behind a collapsed cooling tower. Its General Motors Whirlwind Autocannon 5 opened up at less than 100 meters, the stream of shells hammering the Warhammer's right arm. Armor fragments flew. The PPC mount on that arm shuddered, but held. Elias returned fire with the right PPC alone, the bolt catching the Wolverine in the left leg and nearly buckling the knee actuator. The Wolverine's pilot was skilled, immediately shifting weight to the undamaged leg and retreating, using the cooling tower as cover. Elias didn't pursue. The corridor opened ahead into a large smelting chamber, a cavernous space with a ceiling high enough for mech combat and walls thick enough to contain the violence. This was where he'd planned to make his stand. He entered the smelting chamber and turned, setting the Warhammers back against the far wall. Both PCPs tracked the entrance, the medium lasers armed. Even the small laser and machine gun were ready. Everything he had. The cockpit was hot. The twin PPC shots had dumped massive thermal energy into the Warhammer's frame, and the 20 heat sinks were working overtime to bleed it off. The temperature gauge read 48 degrees Celsius and climbing. Sweat ran down Elias's face, stinging his eyes. He blinked it away. The Warhammer had always run hot. His father's words echoed in his skull. She wants to be warm. The hunchback came through the entrance first, which was exactly what Elias had predicted. The Serpent's Tooth's Lance leader would send the heaviest frontal armor first, and the hunchback's Tomazzuro autocannon 20 was the most devastating short-range weapon in their arsenal. 10 reloads of depleted uranium shells capable of tearing through armor like paper at close range. Elias fired both PPCs into the entrance as the hunchback cleared the doorway. The first bolt hit the right shoulder, just below the massive autocannon mount. The second struck the center torso. The hunchback rocked, but kept coming, its pilot triggering the AC-20 in a thunderous roar that shook the smelting chamber. The stream of shells slammed into the Warhammer's left torso, chewing through armor and reaching for the structure beneath. Warning lights flared across the display. Left torso armor critical. Elias sidestepped, putting a massive smelting crucible between himself and the hunchback, and fired both medium lasers around the obstacle. One missed. The other scored across the hunchback's already damaged left torso, hitting the old repair weld from 5 years ago. The scar split open, and internal components sparkled with electrical discharge. The Wolverine entered the chamber behind the hunchback, moving to Elias's right flank. He was being bracketed exactly as he'd expected. The Wolverine's AC-5 barked again, shells pinging off the Warhammer's right leg. The medium laser mounted on the Wolverine's arm flashed, cutting a line across his hip actuator housing. Heat was becoming a serious problem. The cockpit temperature had climbed to 54 degrees. Elias could feel the mech's movements becoming sluggish as the Myamer bundles protested the thermal overload. He needed to manage his fire, choose his shots, resist the urge to pull every trigger at once. He chose the hunchback. The AC-20 was the greatest threat, and the pilot had exposed the damaged left torso. Elias fired the right PPC only, a single precise shot that punched through the weakened armor of the hunchback's left torso, shearing through internal structure and severing the heavy ammunition feed tracks before it could strike the volatile main pin. The mech shuddered as the massive weapons diagnostic systems engaged emergency safeties. The autocannon fell silent. Ammunition feed, Elias thought. He'd severed the feed mechanism. The hunchback staggered but didn't fall. Its pilot was fighting to keep the machine upright. But without the autocannon, the 50-ton mech was reduced to its pair of diverse optics medium lasers and head-mounted small laser. Still dangerous, but no longer the primary threat. The Marauder entered the smelting chamber. It came through a secondary entrance that Elias hadn't known about. A loading bay on the east wall that had been concealed behind fallen machinery. The 75-ton mech shouldered through the debris with casual violence, its twin PPCs already tracking. It fired, and the world became light and thunder. Both Hellstar bolts struck the Warhammer's centered torso. The impact drove Elias back into the wall, the mech's spine slamming against ferrocrete with a force that cracked his neurohelmet against the headrest. Stars exploded across his vision. Damage warning screamed. Centered torso armor breached. Internal structure compromised. Engine shielding at 60%. Elias tasted blood. He'd bitten his tongue. The coppery warmth filled his mouth, and for one terrible moment, he was back on Dorval's crossing, listening to Rhea Vasquez screaming on the comm as the iron skulls died around her. The rage came then, pure and clean and absolute, burning through the pain and the heat and the fear. He fired everything. Both PPCs, both medium lasers, the small laser, even the machine gun. A fusillade of energy and kinetic death that struck the Marauder across its entire forward profile. The PPCs cratered the arm assemblies. The medium lasers scored the center torso. The machine gun stitched a line of divots across the cockpit housing. The cockpit temperature hit 61 degrees. The Warhammer's movements became jerky, uncoordinated, the myoma bundles reaching their thermal limit. Override alarms wailed, begging Elias to shut down, to let the heat sinks do their work. He slapped the override with a palm slick with sweat and kept firing. The Panther reappeared, darting through the main entrance and adding its PCP to the barrage. The bolt hit the Warhammer's right arm, and this time something gave. The PPC mount cracked, the magnetic containment flickering. The right PPC went offline, its status indicator shifting from green to angry red. 1 PPC against 4 mechs, in a mech that was bleeding armor and choking on its own heat. Elias laughed. It was a raw, broken sound, more animal than human. He'd spent 5 years preparing for this fight, and he'd always known it might kill him. That had never been the point. The point was making sure the Serpent's tooth died with him. He charged the Marauder. The 70-ton Warhammer covered the distance in 4 thundering strides, each footfall cracking the ferrocrete floor. The Marauder fired both PPCs, but the range was too close, the shots passing on either side of the Warhammer's torso and spending themselves against the far wall. Elias rammed the Warhammer's shoulder into the Marauder's center mass, a collision of 145 tons of war machine that shook the entire smelting chamber. The Marauder toppled. 75 tons of metal and fury crashing to the ground, with an impact that registered on seismic sensors across the complex. Elias stood over it. The remaining left arm PCP aimed directly at the cockpit. At this range, he could not miss. The bolt would punch through the cockpit armor, through the pilot's command couch, through the pilot, and into the reactor housing beyond. 1 shot. 1 kill. He almost fired. His finger was on the trigger. Pressure building, the PPC capacitor whining at full charge. The comm channel crackled. A voice, female, calm despite the circumstances. Thorne. Elias Thorne. Before you fire, receive this transmission, please. Elias hesitated. His hand trembled on the trigger. 5 years of hatred screamed at him to shoot, to burn this woman and her mech to slag, to end the Serpent's tooth the way they'd ended the Iron Skulls. But the voice was not begging. It was not threatening. It was stating a fact, offering information, and something in its tone, some note of quiet certainty, made Elias pause. "You have 3 seconds, he said. His voice was a rasp, unused to speaking. Then I fire. Receiving now, encrypted data packet, Thorne family cipher. The comm panel chimed. An incoming data transmission, compressed and encrypted. And the encryption protocol. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. The encryption protocol was the Iron Skull's internal cipher, a code that had died with his unit on Dorval's crossing. A code that no one outside the Iron Skulls should have known. His hand came off the trigger, not because he wanted it to, but because his body had made the decision for him. Some survival instinct deeper than rage, recognizing that what was happening had just changed the rules of everything. "How do you have that cipher?" he whispered. "Open the packet, Thorne. Then we'll talk." He should have fired. Every rational calculation said fire. Kill the Marauder pilot. Deal with the implications later. But the cipher, the Iron Skull's cipher, his family's cipher, it was like hearing a dead person's voice. Elias opened the packet. The data scrolled across his secondary display, dense blocks of text interspersed with financial transaction records, Communication logs and a single high-resolution image. Elias read it once. Quickly. Then again. Slowly. Then a third time, word by word, because his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. The Serpent's tooth had been contracted to destroy the Iron Skulls. That much he knew. That much he had spent 5 years confirming. But the contract hadn't come from an enemy house. It hadn't come from a pirate king, or a corporate rival, or any of the 100 other sources Elias had considered and discarded over the years. The contract had come from the Mercenary Review Board, specifically from a senior handler operating out of the Galatea office. The financial records showed a series of payments laundered through 6 different accounts across 4 worlds, totaling 2.4 million sea bills. The communication logs showed encrypted exchanges between the handler and the Serpent's Tooth's commanding officer, detailing the Iron Skull's deployment schedule, patrol routes, mech readiness states, and shift change times. Information that only someone with access to the Iron Skull's bonded contract file would have known. The image was a personnel file photograph. Gray hair, quiet eyes, a face Elias had trusted for 5 years. Dorian Keech. The cockpit was silent, except for the hum of the reactor and the slow tick of cooling metal. Elias stared at the image on his display. His hands had gone still on the control sticks. His breathing had stopped. The rage that had sustained him for 5 years, the burning, consuming fire that had kept him alive through every frozen night and every desperate fight, guttered and went out like a candle in a vacuum. Keech, his mentor, his handler, the man who had poured him a drink and told him to keep moving, keep fighting, keep hunting. The man who had fed him just enough information to stay on the Serpent's Tooth's trail. Never enough to catch them. Always enough to keep him chasing. 5 years of carefully managed obsession. A puppet dancing on strings he couldn't see. Why? The word came out small, broken. Not the voice of a warrior. The voice of a man whose world had just ended for the second time. The Marauder pilot's voice came through the comm, still calm, still measured. My name is Commander Sarah Voss. I led the operation on Dorval's Crossing. I won't apologize for it, Thorne, because an apology would be obscene. But I will tell you the truth, which is more than Keech ever gave either of us. Elias forced himself to breathe. In, out. The heat in the cockpit was slowly dropping as the sinks did their work, but he barely noticed. Talk, he said. We were approached through a cutout. Blind contract. We didn't know who was paying until after the operation. And by then, the money was in our accounts and we were already ghosts. The target package was detailed. Too detailed for an outside source. Patrol schedules. Comm frequencies. Mech maintenance cycles. Everything we needed to hit the Iron Skulls at their most vulnerable. You didn't question it. We're mercenaries, Thorne. We took the contract. That's what we do. A pause. That's what the Iron Skulls did too. The words hit like a physical blow. Elias closed his eyes. She was right. Mercenary work was mercenary work. You took the contract. You did the job. You got paid. The morality was in the paycheck, not the mission. He'd been raised on that philosophy. After the operation, Voss continued. Things went wrong. The payment came through, but so did a secondary instruction set. We were to scatter, assume new identities, and go dark. Standard operational security for a black contract. But the instructions were too specific. Routes we had to take, worlds we had to visit, timing that seemed arbitrary but wasn't. It took me 3 years to realize we were being herded. Herded where? Toward you, Thorne. Always toward you. Every time you picked up our trail, it wasn't because you were that good. It was because someone wanted you to find a piece of the puzzle. Just enough to keep you moving. Just enough to keep you spending your C-bills and burning through your mech's operational life. Someone wanted you chasing us forever. The pieces fell into place with the horrible click-lock certainty of a targeting solution. Keech, who had encouraged Elias to keep hunting. Keech, who had provided just enough intelligence to be useful. Keech, who had monitored Elias's movements through their monthly encrypted transmissions. Keech, who had always known exactly where the Serpent's tooth was, because Keech was the one controlling their movements. But why? Why destroy the Iron Skulls? Why keep Elias alive? Why manage a 5-year pursuit that consumed one man's life and kept 4 others running? The Iron Skulls stumbled onto something during the Oregon campaign, Voss said, as if reading his thoughts. Your Captain Vasquez filed a sealed report with the MRB before you shipped out to Dorval's Crossing. I don't know what was in it, but Keech was assigned as the reviewing handler, and 2 weeks later, we received the contract. Rhea never mentioned any report. She wouldn't have. It was filed under personal encryption. Captain's eyes only. Whatever she found, she thought it was important enough to bring to the MRB through official channels. And the MRB, or at least Keech's portion of it, decided it was important enough to kill for. Elias's mind raced. The Oregon campaign. 6 months of contract work. Pirate suppression mostly, with some garrison duty in between. What could Rhea have found? The Oregon Reach was a backwater, a collection of minor worlds with minor problems. There was nothing there worth killing an entire mercenary company over. Unless there was. You said you didn't know the client was MRB until after the operation. How did you find out? The same way you would have, eventually. Forensic analysis of the financial transactions. It took us 4 years because we didn't have your friend Keech feeding us breadcrumbs. We had to do it the hard way. But the money trail is solid, Thorne. I wouldn't have lit up that beacon and waited for you to find us if I wasn't sure. You wanted me to find you. I wanted to give you a choice. Kill us or listen. You've listened. Now the choice is what you do next. Elias looked at the damage readout on his display. The Warhammer had taken severe punishment. Left torso armor was nearly gone. Center torso was breached. Right arm PPC was offline. Multiple actuator warnings in both legs. The mech was combat capable. Barely. But another sustained engagement would finish it. The Serpent's tooth was in no better shape. The Hunchback's autocannon was out of action. The Panther had cockpit damage. The Wolverine was limping on a compromised knee actuator, and the Marauder was on its back with a PPC aimed at its face. The data packet, Elias said slowly. The financial records. Can they be verified independently? Every transaction is time-stamped and routed through Comstar banking protocols. You can verify them at any HPG station with a financial forensics suite. It'll take time, but the evidence is there, and the communication logs. Encrypted with MRB internal protocols. You won't be able to decrypt them without access to MRB systems, but the metadata is verifiable. Timestamps, routing nodes, packet sizes. It all matches. Elias stared at the PPC aimed at the Marauder's cockpit. His finger rested on the trigger guard, not the trigger itself, but close. So close. 5 years of his life pointed at this moment, and the moment had betrayed him as thoroughly as Keach had. He thought about the Iron Skulls, about Rhea Vasquez, who had been more mother to him than his own mother had ever been. About his father, Marcus, who had died in his rifleman's cockpit when a pirate lance had caught them on Perdition 7 years before Dorval's crossing. About his grandmother, who had walked a crippled Warhammer out of a crater and built a family around it. He thought about Keach, the quiet voice, the patient eyes, the drink from the desk drawer. 5 years of carefully curated trust, each monthly transmission another thread in a web designed to keep Elias exactly where Keach wanted him, chasing shadows, spending his resources, slowly grinding himself and the Warhammer down to nothing. Eventually, Elias would have caught the Serpent's tooth, and they would have killed each other, and Keach's problem would have solved itself. No loose ends. No witnesses. No one left to ask uncomfortable questions about a sealed report filed by a dead captain. Keach used me, Elias said. The words were flat, deadly. He used all of us. He killed my family and then he used me as a weapon to clean up the evidence. 5 years. He kept me running for 5 years, and I thanked him for it. Yes, Voss said simply. The silence stretched. In the cockpit, something dripped. Coolant, probably, leaking from a cracked line. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees. Almost comfortable. What's in the report? Elias asked. Vasquez's sealed report. What was worth killing 16 people? I don't know, but Keach does. And he's still on Galatea, sitting in his office, pouring drinks for the next poor bastard he's going to manipulate. Whatever Vasquez found, Keach is still protecting it, which means it's still relevant, still dangerous. To whom? That's the question worth killing for, isn't it? Elias closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw Rhea Vasquez's face. Sharp features, dark eyes, a scar across her chin from a neural helmet malfunction 10 years ago. She'd been smart, Rhea. Careful. If she'd filed a sealed report, she'd had a reason. And if the MRB, if Keach had killed the entire Iron Skulls to bury that report, then whatever was in it was worth more than 16 lives. It was worth more than his revenge. The realization was like swallowing broken glass. Elias felt it cut through him, shredding 5 years of carefully constructed purpose. The blood debt, the consuming obsession, the hunt that had become his entire identity. All of it was a lie, not the debt itself. The Iron Skulls were still dead. And someone still owed for that, but the shape of it, the direction. He'd been aiming at the wrong target for 5 years, and the real target had been standing behind him the whole time, whispering encouragement. He opened his eyes. He looked at the PPC, aimed at the Marauder's cockpit. He looked at the damage readout on his Warhammer. He looked at the image of Dorian Keach's face on his secondary display. Then he moved his hand off the trigger. "Get up," he said. The Marauder's pilot didn't respond immediately. Elias heard the click of a comm channel being secured, a brief burst of encrypted traffic between the Serpent's Tooth's formexes. Then Voss spoke again. "You're making a choice, Thorne. I'm making the only choice that matters. Get your mech up. We need to talk, face to face. You understand what you're giving up? I'm giving up a lie. The debt isn't gone, Voss. The Iron Skulls are still dead. My family is still ashes. But the debt belongs to Keach, not you. Not entirely." He paused. "You still pulled the trigger. I did. We'll settle that account someday. But not today. Today, we have a bigger problem." The Marauder's arms moved, bracing against the ground. Slowly, with the grinding protest of damaged actuators, the 75-ton mech pushed itself upright. Elias stepped back, giving it room. The Marauder rose to its full height, and for a moment, the two heavy mechs faced each other across a distance of 10 meters, PPC to PPC, predator to predator. Then Elias powered down his remaining PCP. The capacitor whine faded to silence. The weapon's status light went from green to amber to dark. The Marauder's PPCs powered down a heartbeat later. The smelting chamber was quiet. 4 damaged mechs stood in the wreckage of their own violence, steam rising from overheated armor into the frozen air. Somewhere in the complex, a structure groaned and collapsed, the sound echoing through the ruins like a dying breath. Elias reached up and cracked the cockpit seal. Frozen air rushed in, biting at his sweat-soaked skin. He pulled off his neuro helmet and set it on the console, then leaned back in the command couch and stared at the ceiling. 5 years. 5 years of hunting. And the prey had been hunting the same truth he was. 5 years of hatred, and the real enemy had been feeding him that hatred like fuel for a furnace, keeping him burning, keeping him useful, keeping him blind. Dorian Keach, MRB senior handler, the man who had killed the Iron Skulls, the man who had kept Elias alive, not out of mercy, but out of utility, the man who was, right now, sitting on Galatea with no idea that his 2 weapons had just decided to stop pointing at each other and start pointing at him. Elias smiled again. This time, it was different. It wasn't the cold, predatory expression of a man about to kill. It was something harder, something sharper. The smile of a man who had just found a new purpose in the wreckage of the old one. He keyed the comm. "Voss, Thorne, how fast can your lance be ready to move?" A pause. "The Hunchback needs a new ammo feed. The Wolverine's knee actuator is compromised. My Marauder took structural damage to the right arm assembly. We're looking at 72 hours of field repairs, minimum. My Warhammer needs work too. Center torso is breached, and I've lost a PPC. 72 hours, then. I have a field repair bay in the northern sector of the complex. Basic equipment, but enough to get us moving. Good. 72 hours. Then we talk about Galatea. You want to go after Keech directly. I want answers first. Vasquez's sealed report is still in the MRB archives. If Keech didn't destroy it, and I'm betting he didn't, because a man who keeps weapons doesn't throw away ammunition, then it's still there. We find the report. We find out what was worth killing for. Then we decide what to do about it. That's a dangerous game, Thorne. The MRB has resources, connections. If Keech has been running off-book operations for 5 years, he has contingencies. Then, we'll have to be better than his contingencies. Another pause. When Voss spoke again, there was something new in her voice. Not warmth, not friendship, nothing so simple, but a kind of grim alignment. Two broken compasses that had just found the same magnetic north. Agreed. 72 hours. Then we go hunting. Elias killed the calm and sat in the silence of his cockpit. The frozen wind of Corvost 4 howled through the cracked seal, carrying ice crystals that settled on his skin and melted into droplets that traced down his face like tears. He didn't wipe them away. He thought about Marcus Thorne, sitting in this same seat, teaching a boy how to pilot a machine of war. He thought about his grandmother, walking out of a crater with nothing but a crippled mech and the stubbornness to build something from the wreckage. He thought about Rhea Vasquez, smart enough to find something dangerous, brave enough to report it, and dead because of both. The Warhammer stood in the ruins of the smelting chamber, its armor scarred and broken. One arm dark, coolant leaking from a dozen wounds. It looked like what it was, a machine that had been through hell. But the reactor was still running, the structure was still sound, the remaining PPC was still functional. Like its pilot, the Warhammer was damaged but not destroyed, broken but not beaten. Elias reached up and pulled the cockpit seal closed, shutting out the cold. He powered the systems back to standby and began the slow process of walking the mech toward the northern sector, following the Serpent's tooth through the industrial ruins. 5 minutes ago, these 4 mechs had been trying to kill each other. Now they moved in a ragged column through the frozen complex. A lance of damaged machines, piloted by damaged people, held together by nothing more than a shared enemy and the terrible gravity of truth. It wasn't trust. Trust was a word for people who hadn't been betrayed. What it was, Elias decided, was something older and more honest. A transaction. The Serpent's tooth had information. Elias had 5 years of rage that needed a new direction. Together, they had enough firepower to make someone very uncomfortable. Dorian Keech had built a machine of manipulation, using mercenaries as pawns in a game whose rules only he understood. He had killed the Iron Skulls to protect a secret. He had kept Elias alive to hunt the evidence. He had managed the Serpent's tooth like chess pieces, moving them across the board in patterns designed to intersect with Elias at just the right moments. Never close enough to end the chase. Always close enough to keep it going. But machines break down, pawns develop their own agendas, and chess pieces, if they ever figure out that they're being played, become the most dangerous things on the board. Elias Thorne, last of the Iron Skulls, piloted his family's Warhammer through the frozen ruins of Corvost 4. Behind him, 3 mechs that had once been his mortal enemies fell into formation. Ahead of him, the long road to Galatea stretched across the stars, cold and dark and full of danger. The blood debt was not settled. It had merely changed creditors. And Dorian Keach, sitting in his quiet office on the Mercenary star, pouring drinks and spinning lies, had no idea that the weapon he had so carefully aimed was now turning in his hand. The repair bay was a gutted machine shop in the northern sector, its roof half collapsed, but its walls still solid enough to block the wind. Voss had set up portable generators and a basic maintenance gantry. The 4 mechs of the Serpent's Tooth stood in their cradles, and the Warhammer occupied a 5th slot that had been hastily cleared of debris. For 3 days, the sound of welders, rivet guns, and cursing filled the frozen air. Elias worked on his own mech. He always did. No one else touched the Warhammer. It was the last rule of the Iron Skulls he still kept. He patched the center torso breach with salvaged armor plate, reseated the right PPC's magnetic containment housing, and replaced 2 heat sinks that had cracked under the thermal stress of the battle. It wasn't pretty work. The welds were rough, the replacement parts were scavenged and ill-fitting, and the PPC's diagnostic came back at 83% efficiency instead of full capacity. But it would function. It would fire. On the 2nd day, Sarah Voss climbed down from her Marauder's cockpit and crossed the repair bay to where Elias was working. She was shorter than he'd imagined. Compact, dark skin, close-cropped hair, a network of old burn scars across the left side of her neck that disappeared beneath the collar of her cooling suit. Her eyes were steady and unreadable. She carried 2 field ration packets in a thermos. She set 1 packet on the Warhammer's foot and unscrewed the thermos. "Coffee," she said. "Terrible coffee, but hot." Elias looked at the offering. He looked at the woman who had led the assault that killed his family. He looked at the scars on her neck and wondered if the Iron Skulls had given them to her. He took the coffee. They sat on the Warhammer's foot, side by side, and ate cold rations in a silence that was neither comfortable nor hostile. It simply was. 2 professionals acknowledging a shared situation with the pragmatism of people who had long since abandoned the luxury of sentiment. "The hunchback pilot," Elias said eventually. "Dorval's Crossing." He put a full AC-20 burst into the barracks. Our off-duty pilots were in there. Voss didn't flinch. "Gregor Holt. He's the one you hit with the PPC on your way in. He carries that scar. And yes, the barracks was a designated target. I know what that means. Do you?" "I do, and I will carry it to my grave. But right now, I need you to understand something, Thorne. Holt follows my orders. My pilots follow my orders. If we're going to work together, you need to accept that I command my lance and you command your mech, and the debts between us get settled after Keach is dealt with. Not before. Elias stared at his coffee. The steam rose into the frozen air, curling and dissipating. After, he said quietly. After. They finished their rations in silence and went back to work. On the third day, the mechs were ready. Not repaired. Not truly. But functional. Combat capable. If you were generous with the definition. 5 mechs. A Warhammer. A Marauder. A Wolverine. A hunchback with a jury-rigged autocannon feed, and a panther with a cracked viewport sealed with industrial adhesive. A lance and a half of battered machines, crewed by people who had every reason to kill each other, and one very compelling reason not to. They gathered in the repair bay's makeshift briefing area, a cleared space where Voss had set up a portable holographic projector. The display showed a star map centered on Galatea. Elias stood on one side. The Serpent's Tooth's 4 pilots stood on the other. The gap between them was 3 meters wide and 5 years deep. Galatea, Voss said, the Mercenary star. MRB Regional Headquarters. Keach operates out of the 3rd floor of the administration building in the hiring hall district. He has access to bonded contract archives, financial systems, and the communication network that connects every MRB office in the inner sphere. Security? Elias asked. Light by military standards. The hiring hall has a garrison of conventional infantry and light vehicles. No mechs stationed permanently, but there are always mercenary units in port looking for work. If Keach calls for help, he'll have it within hours. Then we don't give him hours. Elias pointed to the star map. We need to get to Galatea without triggering any of his early warning systems. He's been monitoring my communications for 5 years. If I suddenly go dark, he'll know something has changed. So don't go dark, said the Wolverine pilot, a lanky man named Reese with a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles. Send your usual monthly report. Tell him you're following a lead in the Periphery. Buy us time. Elias nodded slowly. I can do that. But the moment we arrive on Galatea, the clock starts. Keach will have eyes at every spaceport. Voss manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on Galatea's surface. We don't go through the main spaceport. I have a contact on Galatea who operates a private landing facility. Gray market, no questions asked, no manifests filed. We can land mechs there and be operational within 6 hours. And then we walk into the MRB administration building and have a conversation with Dorian Keach. Voss looked at Elias across the holographic glow. The kind of conversation that involves access codes, sealed archives, and the truth about what Captain Vasquez found in the Oregon Reach. Elias met her gaze. In the blue light of the holographic display, the scars on her neck stood out in sharp relief. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't offering friendship. She was offering what mercenaries had always offered each other: a deal. Services rendered for payment received. The currency, in this case, was justice. Or something close enough to justice that a man who had spent 5 years drowning in hatred could breathe again. 9 days to Galatea via dropship from the jump point, Elias said. If your contact can arrange transport for 5 mechs, she can. It'll cost us everything we have left. I stopped caring about sea bills a long time ago. Voss nodded. She looked at her pilots. They looked back. Whatever passed between them was invisible to Elias, but he recognized it. Unit communication. The silent language of people who had fought and bled together. The Serpent's tooth had it. The Iron Skulls had had it once. We go to Galatea, Voss said. We find the truth, and whatever that truth is, Keech answers for what he's done. To the Iron Skulls, to us, to whoever else he's destroyed to keep his secrets. The holographic star map glowed between them, Galatea pulsing at its center like a blue-white heart. 5 damaged warriors in a frozen ruin on the edge of nowhere, planning an operation that was equal parts military assault and suicide mission. The odds were terrible. The risks were worse. And the only thing holding the fragile alliance together was a shared conviction that some debts cannot go unpaid. Elias Thorne looked at the star map. He thought of his father, his grandmother, Rhea Vasquez, 16 dead Iron Skulls who deserved better than a lie for a legacy. For the Iron Skulls, he said quietly. The words hung in the frozen air. No one echoed them. No one needed to. The blood debt had found its true debtor, and Galatea was waiting.